Burkineji people. The Burkineji were a pastoral community who inhabited regions of northern Kenya through to the late 19th century. The present-day Samburu consider themselves a descendant community of the Burkineji. Etymology. Stigan 1913 noted that Alala Burkineji was a Ma term meaning the people of the white goats, 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 goats. Territory. Von Honel 1894, writing following his journey to Lake Turkana, noted that the Burkineji originally occupied districts on the west of Lake Turkana. History. C. 1730, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830, 1830. Bantu interaction. Muru traditions recorded by Fadiman indicate that a Ma-speaking community recalled as Muoko, a name that has been linked to Kor/Sambur, occupied the Tigania Plain during the 1730s when contact with the pre-Muru clans occurred. The Muoko are recalled as being more numerous than their neighbors, though seemingly less so than the incoming migrants. These traditions portray conflict occurring between the Muoko and pre-Muru. Tiganian warriors took the Muoko by surprise, seizing 4 great herds in an initial skirmish, then moved livestock, women, children, and the aged into a single, defensible camp. The Muoko, perhaps initially outnumbered, reacted by barring the intruders from both water and salt, systematically burying salt licks and springs to prevent their discovery and use. The Muoko also had stabbing spears, a weapon Tiganians could not forge. They responded with bow and arrow, ambushing Muoko herders in the long grass. They crept like rats, sang the Muoko of their foes and stampeding their herds. Fadiman notes that the traditions speak of decades of war, though suggests that it was more likely a time of dry season raiding on both sides. During this time, the Tiganians mastered the art of forging spears, following which the Muoko were forced steadily into the arid northeast away from the fertile grassland region. C. 1830, 1830, in 30. Fragmentation. Samburu historians interviewed by Straight et al. 2016 state that the Samburu separated from an agglomeration known as Burkineji. They note that the Samburu Burkineji separated from the other Ma speakers in the wake of the 1830s Mutai. Turkana Burkineji conflict. Turkana narratives recorded by Lamphere 1988 provide a broad perspective of the prelude to the conflict between the Turkana and a community he refers to as Kor, a name by which the Turkana still call the Samburu in the present day. By the end of the Palagem initiations, the developing Turkana community was experiencing strong ecological pressures. Behind them, up the escarpment in Karamoja, other evolving acre societies, such as the Karamojong and Dodos, were occupying all available grazing lands. Therefore, Turkana cattle camps began to push further down the Tarash, which ran northwards below the foothills of the Moro-Asidger Massif on their right and the escarpment on their left. As they advanced, the Turkana came to realize they were not alone in this new land. At night, fires could be seen flickering on the slopes of nearby mountains, including empty Pelaki, which loomed up in the distance directly before them. Lamphere notes that Turkana traditions aver that a dreamer among them saw strange animals living with the people up in the hills. Turkana warriors were thus sent forward to capture one of these strange beasts, which the dreamer said looked like giraffes, but with humps on their backs. The young men therefore went and captured one of these beasts, the first camels the Turkana had seen. The owners of the strange beasts appear to have struck the Turkana as strange as well. The Turkana saw them as red people, partly because of their lighter skin, and partly because they daubed their hair and bodies with reddish clay. They thus gave them the name Kor, Lamphere states that Turkana traditions agree that the Kor were very numerous and lived in close pastoral association with two other communities known as Rantol and Porin. These are analogous with the present-day Rendile and Borin communities. According to von Honel 1894, a few decades prior, the Burkineji occupied districts on the west of the lake and that they were later driven eastwards into present-day Samburu. He later states that some 50 years ago the Turkana owned part of the land on the west now occupied by the Karamoyo, whilst the southern portion of their land belonged to the Burkineji. The Karamoyo drove the Turkana further east, and the Turkana in their turn pushed the Burkineji towards Samburuland. At the time of von Honel's visit the Burkineji and Rendile had previously frequented the shores of the lake but had stopped as at that time due to frequent attacks by the Turkana. Loikip. According to traditions recorded by MacDonald, the Loikip society fragmented as it expanded from a territory located east of Lake Turkana. This led to the development of three groupings within Loikip society: the Sambur, who occupied the original country east of Lake Turkana, as well as the Laikipia Plateau. The Uasin occupied the grass plateaus of the Uasin and Mao, while the Maasai territory extended from Naivasha to Kilimanjaro. Rendile Sambur conflict. Smallpox. Arkell Hardwick records that the Burkineji survived a smallpox epidemic, which seems to have affected their neighbors earlier, by sending the young men away to different camps. The Rendile, previously powerful, had not been so fortunate and had been greatly impacted by the epidemic. By the time of Arkell Hardwick's writing they had come under the protection of the Burkineji, who were perfectly willing to protect the Rendile, but in return they considered that they ought to be allowed the right to help themselves from the Rendile flocks. Somali conflict. Arkell Hardwick, an ivory hunter who visited North Kenya at the turn of the 19th century, wrote of a Burkineji community living in association with a community he referred to as Rendile. He records that at some prior point the Burkineji and Rendile had allied together to fight the Aged and Somali. During this conflict the Somali were armed with old muzzle-loading guns, using very inferior powder and spherical bullets, which the Rendile declared. Late 19th century. Arkell Hardwick made note of von Honel's mention of Rendile inhabiting the largest of the three islands in the south end of Lake Turkana, the other two being occupied by Burkineji and Rishiat. He also speaks of settlements of mixed Rendile and Burkineji in the western portion of the Rishiat country, at the north end of the lake. He notes that at the time there were populations of Burkineji on Mount Nero, where they had settled to escape attacks by the Turkana. Turkana raids. In May 1888, von Honel heard from a Burkineji woman that the Turkana had suffered severe scarcity about 3 months before then. It seems these prompted raids on the Burkineji and Rendile. The second of these raids, during which the Turkana captured a number of livestock, had recently occurred, and as a result all the people of the plundered districts, Burkineji and Rendile alike, had combined to make an incursion on Turkana. Way of life. The Burkineji were pastoralists and had large herds of donkeys, though at least as of the late 19th century they did not keep horses as their neighbors the Rendile did. Most of the Burkineji of the late 19th century wore cloth referred to as lassos, of which they had a preference for gaudily colored types. They spoke Maasai, but most understood the Rendile language. References ==